there is a need to give 180 degrees before 90 and 180. What does this mean? I have everything. I have everything. I have everything. All the other tissues are with me. When I place the partition inside the magnetic field, all the protons aligned in the z direction with the main magnetic field. You might say, what will I do now? I will do something nice. Instead of making it 90 degrees, which would place my mz, the longitudinal magnetization, in the xy direction, I will keep it in the z direction, but in the negative direction below. So how do you do it? You give the flip angle, which is the angle you use to change the longitudinal magnetization. Instead of giving 90 degrees, you give 180 degrees. This 180 degrees flips the mz from the positive direction to the negative direction. It's nice because it maintains the same magnitude, meaning it is strong, but in the negative direction. The strength of the magnetic field, folks, the color of the signal, its brightness, is highly dependent on the magnetic properties or the magnetic force of the tissue. The higher the longitudinal magnetization, for example, in this case, the image imposed on the grayscale appears bright, showing a white signal that I will detect. This is your scale that represents the relationship between the magnetic field in a disk, or the strength of magnetism, or the magnetic field strength of different tissues, and its relation to brightness, or the color present everywhere. If you are dealing with T1, then the white color indicates a more bright signal, meaning a strong signal, which indicates strong magnetization, whether in the positive direction or in the negative direction. Both are the same. Okay. The longitudinal magnetization is present in the negative direction or at the extremes of the positive or negative directions. You need bright signal. But if magnetization reaches null point, this area, which is the NAL point for you, or the XY area, in this plan, when reaching the zero magnetization stage at this point, there is no longitudinal magnetization. As we mentioned, when you apply your RF pulse, you do it to move the longitudinal magnetization from the Z direction to where? To the XY plane. Now, if the longitudinal magnetization is present in both X and Y, will it be affected? It will not be affected. This is what we are trying to achieve. But how do we do it? When you apply the 180-degree flip angle, the fat and other tissues return to the negative direction quickly, because fat returns quickly, reaching the zero magnetization area faster than other tissues. The closer something is to the T1 constant, the faster it reaches zero magnetization at that time. At this moment, your sequence called ecosequence, with the 90 degrees and 180 degree flip angles, will be affected by the magnetic force in the longitudinal direction, which includes other tissues like water and the rest of the tissues present here. For better images, if I give you 90-degree pulses, what will be affected? The choices that have T1 or have magnetization will start giving you a reference in the signal and continue the sequence normally with 90 and 180 degrees. How do I want to talk about this? This is inversion recovery, so you choose the timing between the 180-degree pulses and the 90-degree pulse. This is the time inversion. In the case of fat, where you want to do fat suppression, the time inversion is short, a short time inversion, because if you wait too long, what will happen is that the fat will come back and rise to the poster, and the fluid will return. So you want to choose a specific area where the fat is 0 while there is still strength for the fluid. So the fluid appears while the fat shows a weak signal or a black signal. That's why you make your choices. Okay, the amplitude dropped in this way and is around 130 milliseconds. After the amplitude, when the 180-degree pulses are applied, the signals return to near 0 point or null point. At this time, the 90-degree and 180-degree sequences begin because the amplitude is effectively 0, meaning there will be no excitation occurring for it. This is what happens with fat, while the part that still retains some of its properties will still be affected when you apply the angle you provided in the different direction, but it still retains the magnetization. So, what happens in the exploitation? The relationship between the signal here is that the signal is strong. But in the negative direction, the fat increases until it reaches 0, and then its signal rises again. The choices close to fat behave the same way. And water takes a long time to reach null or 0 magnetization. Okay, fine. This is the same thing. Here is the signal, but we just remove this part and express it as if it is our signal, nothing more. Here we are talking about the signal. I mean, this yellow one is your amplitude here as a reference. After that, you go down to 0. Then you go up twice. What do we have? After that, the string. It takes a long time. The time you take from 180 to 90 degrees in a typical T1 spin echo sequence means that when you apply the 90-degree pulse, you won't find fat magnetization, and all the tissues close to it will experience suppression. Only water and fluid or nearby substances will appear in the sequence. He said that we will perform a fluid attenuated inversion recovery sequence. Instead of waiting a short time, I will wait a longer time, for example, up to 2500 milliseconds, or until the fluid reaches 0 magnetization, and then apply the RF pulse at that time. Oh, so you want to say that at this time, the fluid is what will show up for you, right, doctors? At this time, what will appear? It will show a beautiful black fruit. It will be dark at this point. This is what you did. You waited a long time until the fluid reached your 0 points, and the RF pulse in this case became your choices. Of course, you reached above, so it will create an image contrast and give you different colors. Meanwhile, the water will appear black, which is why when we look here, what do you see? This is a FLAIR image. The fluids present in the image appear dark. You have done it, but there is still some left. It will give you your reference and will perform the fluid's attenuation, but the remaining choices still have a signal and still contain magnetization. So take this signal on your grayscale and it will give you a contrast. It is very beneficial for you to differentiate between the content that has flood and the content that has fat, especially if you use a sequence like FLAIR, and are sure that if there was subtraction in a certain pathology in flood, then at that moment the content of your lesion or pathology is flood. If there was no subtraction, then it is fat, which allows you to understand the content of your pathology. In this case, you are continuously gaining more information. We are continuously obtaining information, as every sequence provides you with data that you can use to understand different tissues and the various pathologies present in the MRI. The same applies here. If I am going to work on FLAIR, I am talking about short time inversion or short time short TI. If I am talking about FLAIR, then it is long TI, which is the time inversion. Here, of course, I choose to apply my signal, which is 90 after 180, and here the time is short, so my TI here is short. However, here the Ti, which is large, is the area where the fat is equal to 0. FLAIR and STIR have issues, doctors, right? Of course, because the image you are taking depends on what is in the magnetic field, in the longitudinal magnetization, and not in the transverse. Are we moving towards the transverse? No. This is what returns to the longitudinal, which includes 180. The longitudinal was here 100%, and when it went down, it also became 100%. Transverse? No. That is what returns to the longitudinal, and what you are managing is 180. The longitudinal, keep in mind, was here 100%, and when it went down, it also remained 100%. It means he is still in his strength. You understand what I mean? He is coming back. He is coming back again in the positive direction with the same magnetic force, with his strength. You didn't come towards the transverse, right? I hope you understand. Oh, God, I advise you. Of course, here, if you have different sequences, for example, like STIR, you have selected an inversion time of 180 milliseconds, which is considered a low inversion time. So, you performed fat suppression here at 400 milliseconds. And here you can do white matter suppression at 2500 milliseconds. You can also adjust the inversion time to see which one you want to perform suppression on in your sequence. Of course, the problem with inversion recovery is that artifacts appear with it, and it requires a more homogeneous magnetic field. It can be performed on open MRI, but with a higher magnetic field, it will be better. It's not the same as fat saturation, which requires a higher magnetic force because you need a significant difference between fat and water. However, FLAIR and STIR can be used with open MRI. The process of signal subtraction reduces your SNR. When you apply a 180-degree pulse, it increases something called the specific absorption rate, SAR. What is the specific absorption rate? It is the energy that tissues absorb from the 180 RF pulse. This energy, or SAR, indicates the amount of energy the body absorbs from the RF pulse. The higher the SAR value, the more it increases with the strength of the RF pulse. A 90-degree pulse is different from a 180-degree pulse, with the latter being stronger. So, in this case, when you apply a 180-degree pulse, followed by a 90-degree pulse, and then another 180-degree pulse, it means that your SAR has increased. As we will discuss later in MRI safety, you will understand that there are levels of SAR that we should not exceed. By the way, we mentioned that the difference between fat and water is 220. Subscribe to the channel. We talked about the difference between fat and water, how significant this difference is, and why we understand it. This is because the structure of fat is different from the structure of water, and the movement of the molecules of water is different from the movement of the molecules of fat. There is a difference in frequency between fat and water. The molecules of water, or the hydrogen atoms present in water, resonate at a frequency higher than the hydrogen atoms found in fat, approximately by 220 Hertz, if I am working at 1.5 Tesla. This difference in frequency is very important because it allows you to create a sequence. Instead of just focusing on fat, you are also considering everything that is associated with fat and is close to it. If you can, identify or determine what is inside the fat that spins quickly. We said 222 Hertz with 1.5 Tesla. So in this particular scenario, if you have this difference, you can precisely determine how much fat is processed by frequency at that specific time. If you apply a pulse that essentially saturates the signal from the fat, then you have managed to eliminate the signal coming from the fat molecules only and exclusively. If you have pathology or anything that you suspect contains fat or water content, in this case, the tissues close to the fat that you haven't approached will remain present, and the water will still be there. Make sure to determine exactly how much fat is in your image or pathology. How do you do this? This is where the spectral resaturation inversion recovery comes into play, transitioning to the selective enhancement. The same idea applies. I am working on this, but I play around a bit first by applying a 180 pulse to achieve a specific outcome. The idea is that you will give a 180 pulse, but with a frequency equal to the frequency of fat suppression for what you want to image. In this case, who will receive the energy and what will happen to the fat or the other tissues? Fat is correct. I am just asking if, you have these pests, future pests, future pests, future pests, future pests, these pests, future pests, these. What happens is similar to what we were talking about, so pray for it. Or negative 180. Wait for it to flip and hold on until it reaches 0. At that time, give a 90-degree pulse, and the 180 will show that your fat will appear dark. Your image will take all the complete information from this. So at that time, you give the fat and the water, providing the pulse that essentially saturates the fat. If we take another look at the image, how the whole world here is supposed to be entirely illuminated. This is before you do your process. Ultimately, this is approximately how it works. Carefully. You worked on the fat and you reduced it completely. So now you have brought it down to 0 and your image appeared like this. For example, in these two images, this bright area here is illuminated and the area inside is also the same, illuminated. I refer to the spiral as a spiral. The image appears this way because everything that is bright has undergone separation in this image. This is more selective. More selective is better than the spiral because in separation you have achieved clarity. Additionally, the stir was reducing the SNR. Now, if I were to ask you a question, does the stir or fat saturation work on open MRI? If it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? Can you explain why it doesn't work? Yes, right, doctor. As you need a high magnetic field and homogeneous magnetic field. Both a high and homogeneous magnetic field are essential. Why do you want to differentiate? If you need a high magnetic field and a more homogeneous magnetic field, such as in scientific experiments or medical imaging, you want to differentiate between the frequency of fat and the frequency of the hydrogen water present here. This difference is not considered significant, so you need a very strong magnetic force to initiate the signals inside the patient's body. Why is the signal from closed MRI better than that from open MRI? Because the magnetic force is higher. What does this mean? It means that the number of protons you will work with inside the patient's body increases, allowing you to excite a larger number. The magnetic field at 1.5 Tesla does not stimulate the same number as at 3 Tesla or 7 Tesla, so the number will increase. Additionally, the difference between fat and water becomes more pronounced with a high magnetic field as well as with a homogeneous magnetic field. That's why you perform it with high magnetic or high magnet with closed MRI. If you are working with open MRI, you will find that the quality cannot be the same. The closed MRI operates at, for example, 0.5 Tesla. All good. There is a concept called magnetization transfer contrast, which is naturally found within our bodies. It exists. There is a term called bound molecules. There is something referred to as bound water and something else referred to as free water. In our bodies, in the tissues present there are bound molecules such as large macromolecules that have limited movement in this surrounding water environment. The specific type of water or tissues that are close enough to these macromolecules is often referred to specifically as bound water itself. Meanwhile, those molecules which exist outside or move freely around them are called free-moving waters instead of being restricted like their counterparts inside cells. He said the macromolecules of this, it received her and lost her to the prison or to the shelf. The energy loss is very fast after you take it. I mean, as soon as I want to use my shelf, it decays very quickly, so it loses its energy rapidly. So what do you want to do? Or what is the issue with the transfer contrast? He told you that now when I come to image the arteries, which of these two images is better, doctors? Is this one the cerebral angiography? Or is this one better? It's definitely better because there is resolution and very good contrast between the cerebral arteries and the background. The background signal has experienced saturation and suppression, resulting in high contrast, so the resolution is better. The same applies here. If I show you this image, if we look at the background here and the background here, and this cerebral artery and this artery, the one on the other side is hidden because the background here is not clear, high signal, and the background here is a lower signal. This background is part of the tissue and the cerebral artery itself. You want to achieve this, meaning what you want to do is to create a sequence or apply something called saturation. This pulse is given to you by the macromolecules, where you use these macromolecules before your sequence, before your spin echo. What do the macromolecules do? The macromolecules lose their energy to the surrounding water molecules. Macromolecules lose their energy to the surrounding tissue. What does this do? It works before your sequence, which I call magnetization transfer contrast. What does this do? It suppresses the signal from the tissue, allowing you to have the remaining signal, like from blood. Blood, especially cerebral blood, doesn't stop moving, even if it receives energy that I already mentioned, or saturation. The RBCs that have been affected continue to move in their phase. New blood comes in, and if I apply a short sequence, I can receive a signal from it. The blood vessels appear like this, and the signal is the water, and here are the macromolecules. The signal is transmitted through magnetization transfer. It starts to create a separation of the signals from the tissues around the free water. This is called MTC, or magnetization transfer contrast, and it's an option available in the devices. They can use it with contrast agents, especially with MRI and angiography. For example, as you can see here, there is a lesion in the same place where gadolinium enhancement is applied to the right image because I used MTC. This is because you created a separation of the tissues around your contrast agent, which increased the SNR, making the contrast agent appear in your lesion. Now, we are talking about this is the macromolecules transfer that occurs, and this is the water signal. This is the macromolecules. Process of energy transfer, which occurs through something called dipole-dipole interaction. There is no need to go into details, but the molecules or the energy transfer. Any molecules in the world are essentially dipoles, meaning they have a positive part and a negative part, with one part being positive and the other being neutral. The dipole interaction occurs when you have one molecule with a positive and a negative part, and another molecule with a positive and a negative part, leading to interactions between these dipoles, between tissues, or between macromolecules and both bound water and free water.